The 1992 film Last of the Mohicans, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, is set against the backdrop of the French and Indian War, the North American theatre of the 7 Years' War. With incredible landscapes and haunting music, the spine of the story involves a siege at a British-held fort in what is now New York State, and the subsequent massacre of the survivors by Native Americans. And whilst the film plays fast and loose with the 19th century novel of the same name by James Fenimore Cooper, as indeed did a 1936 film, the actual siege and massacre were genuine historical events. So, let's explore the siege and massacre at Fort William Henry in August 1757. The British and the French have been fighting each other for mastery of North America, or at least the eastern part of it, ever since 1613. The most serious and history-changing conflict was the French and Indian War, which broke out in 1754 when a British colonial unit attacked a French unit in the Ohio Valley. And the British officer's name? George Washington. By 1756, Britain and France were fighting each other in the 7 Years' War, and the conflict in North America simply became part of that wider conflict. By then, the war in America had shifted to the upper Hudson Valley. If the French could seize it, they could march on New York and split the British colonies in two. Their plans were thwarted in the September at the Battle of Lake George. The French retreated to Fort Carillon at the north end of the 45-square-mile lake, and the British decided to build a fort at the very southern end of the same lake. Fort William Henry, named after two members of the British royal family, was built to traditional European fortress designs of the day by Captain Eyre of the 44th Foot, whose regiment then garrisoned it. The following year, 1756, and the start of the full-scale 7 Years' War between Britain and France, saw the arrival in North America of a new dynamic French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm. An experienced soldier in Europe, despite being only 35, it wasn't long before he took the war to the British, successfully capturing Fort Oswego on the shore of Lake Ontario. And it was here that we have a taste of what was going to happen at Fort William Henry, when his Native American allies killed about 100 British prisoners. Speaking of Fort William Henry, Captain Eyre and the 44th Regiment were still there when, in March 1757, the French attacked. Eyre was actually able to hold off the attack, but not before the retreating French set fire to over 200 of his bateaux moored on the shoreline. Bateaux are large flat-bottomed boats, not dissimilar to a barge, capable of carrying loads of up to a ton. Not as fast and agile as native canoes, their role was to move men and equipment up and down the lake. Without those boats, the British were now unable to take any offensive actions against the French, either at Fort Carillon or at Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. The French, however, had plenty of such boats, and once the ice had melted, they intended to return, and in force. By then, there would be a new British garrison at Fort William Henry, and it's that garrison that met the fate recorded in The Last of the Mohicans. The British now decided to turn their attention to the fortress at Louisbourg in what is now Nova Scotia, and pulled their troops, including the 44th, out of positions elsewhere on the frontier. A great strategic move, as long as the French didn't attack anywhere else along that frontier. Are you guessing where this story might go? The 35th Regiment of Foot, along with the 60th, were now sent to garrison Fort William Henry. The 35th Regiment of Foot, later the Royal Sussex Regiment, had been raised in Ireland in 1701 from the local Protestant population, and hence the orange facings on their uniforms. Despite those Irish roots, by January 1757, of the regiment's 905 men, just over half came from England, although something like 2/3 of its officers were still Irish and Protestant. Case in point, their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel George Monro. Having only just arrived from Dublin via Plymouth in England, Monro had proceeded with half the regiment to Fort William Henry, while the rest were stationed at Fort Edward, about 15 miles downriver towards New York. Monro was reinforced by several companies of the 60th Regiment of Foot. Later the King's Royal Rifles, at this stage in the history of the British Army, the 60th were largely recruited from American colonists, principally German-speaking settlers, and also bore the name Royal American Regiment. Finally, they were joined by a Royal Artillery detachment who manned the 18 cannon defending the fort. With intelligence provided by future Revolutionary General Israel Putnam, who had scouted the lake with a group of rangers from Connecticut, that the French were once more preparing to go on the offensive, Monro was sent about 1,500 colonial militia to reinforce his position. The British force now numbered 2,300, so many men in fact that they couldn't all fit into the little fort. Up to 1,800 men were moved to an entrenched rocky hilltop about 750 yards away. And meanwhile, what were the French doing at the other end of the lake? Well, the Marquis de Montcalm had assembled 3,000 regular soldiers in their white uniforms recently arrived from France, and these were joined by 3,000 French colonial militia. Already, he had a force double the size of Monro's. But then, he played his trump card. During the series of wars between the British and French in North America, both sides had made use of Native Americans. Montcalm was no exception. In fact, he had a high opinion of his allies, writing, quote, "In the midst of the woods of America, one can no more do without Indians than without cavalry in open country." He sent out word promising plunder, captives and scalps to those who joined him, and based upon his success at Fort Oswego and the Indian share of plunder and scalps taken there, he found an enthusiastic audience. By the end of July 1757, 1,600 warriors from 33 nations, some travelling thousands of miles from the Great Lakes, had arrived at his base at the northern end of Lake George. The Abenaki, the Ottawa, the Sauk, the Fox, the Iowa, the list went on. It was the greatest native recruiting drive in the history of French colonial North America. But whilst the French were fighting for their king, these tribesmen were here for the booty and the scalps. It was a potential recipe for disaster. On the 3rd of August, Lieutenant Colonel Monro was urgently summoned to the ramparts of his fort. Looking out northwards across the lake was a sight to behold. 250 bateaux, surrounded by hundreds of canoes, were heading straight towards him, flying the old royalist French flag. In the centre were 60 bateaux tied together almost like a giant catamaran. This strange vessel was, despite its size, lying low in the water, which meant only one thing. Montcalm had brought his heavy guns. Despite being fought in the virgin forests of North America, the siege of Fort William Henry was a textbook European-style siege. Gun emplacements were erected, trenches sheltered Montcalm's men from returning British fire, whilst his own guns bombarded the fort and moved ever closer. And meanwhile, his Native American allies patiently awaited their moment. Inside the fort, which apart from the never-ending bombardment was now also struck down by an outbreak of smallpox, Monro desperately sent a message to General Webb at Fort Edward, 15 miles down the Hudson Valley, requesting assistance. His runner made it through the surrounding French and Indian troops and ran the 15 miles to Fort Edward. There, General Webb's 3,500-strong garrison had just been reinforced by 1,500 militiamen under General William Johnson, an Irish settler, trader and sometime administrator. Despite the Irishman's urgings to break the siege, Webb responded that his intelligence suggested that the French force was 11,000 strong and refused to budge. Now, quite where this intelligence that doubled the size of Montcalm's army actually came from is unclear. Certainly Johnson was highly suspicious and later called Webb a coward. Instead, Webb wrote a letter advising that Monro's surrender and sent it back with the runner. On the 9th of August, 6 days into the siege, after a particularly fierce 3-hour bombardment, Monro saw a young French officer approaching under a white flag. It was Montcalm's young aide-de-camp, Louis-Antoine Bougainville. He would later go on to become the first Frenchman to circumnavigate the globe, and after whom the plant, Bougainvillea, is named. But back on the 9th of August 1757, he advanced towards the fort, bearing a blood-stained letter. It was Webb's message. The runner had been killed by Montcalm's Native Americans. The terrible truth dawned on him. His walls had been breached by the French cannon firing from just 250 yards away. Many of his own cannon had been destroyed, and smallpox was running rife through his garrison. And there'd be no rescue from General Webb. George Monro finally agreed to surrender. Impressed by the stubborn defence, Montcalm granted full honours of war in return for that surrender. In other words, the garrison could march out with colours flying, and they could carry their muskets, but no ammunition, plus one token cannon, and they would be escorted to Fort Edward. In return for this honourable surrender, Monro and the men of the 35th agreed to a parole that they wouldn't fight the French in North America for the next 18 months. It sounds incredibly quaint, but actually it was common practice in Europe at this time. However, it wasn't common practice amongst the Indian nations of North America, as we're about to find out. That evening, Monro moved his men out of the fort and into the nearby hilltop camp, leaving his wounded to be tended by the French. So far, so good. The French had captured Fort William Henry, and Monro and his entire garrison, including the civilian camp followers, would march home in the morning. The Native Americans in the French army could not believe the deal. They had been promised scalps and plunder and captives, but Montcalm had, in their eyes, betrayed them with this deal. They decided to take matters into their own hands. That night, they entered the fort and systematically killed the wounded. Such was their bloodlust that they even dug up the bodies of the dead to scalp them. The French tried in vain to prevent the slaughter, but seemed powerless against the determined tribesmen. Montcalm even suggested to Monro that maybe the prisoners should march south that night, but he feared for both his prisoners and his own guards safely marching through the forests with prowling Indians nearby. And why didn't Monro do anything? Well, for a start, his men were the prisoners of the French. In the Code of Conduct in Europe, his men were therefore, in theory, under French protection. It was their job, the French job, to protect them. And anyway, his men had muskets, but no musket balls. However, the tribesmen did keep away from Monro's camp, and thus it was early the next morning, the 10th of August 1757, that his column lined up and set off for Fort Edward, with the 35th leading the way and the colonial militiamen and the 100 civilian camp followers bringing up the rear. Almost immediately, the Native Americans pounced. Whilst they tried to strip and rob the men at the front of the column, who fought back with musket butts and fists, the real terror occurred at the rear. There all hell broke loose as any inhibitions the betrayed Indians had disappeared. Wholesale looting, prisoner-taking, killing and scalping descended on those colonials at the back of the column. Montcalm personally tried to intervene, exposing his chest and daring his native allies to kill him before the civilians. Interestingly, it's only the French that recall this event, so maybe he did put his life on the line, or maybe, with hindsight, he just wanted to distance himself from the massacre. Afterwards, he stated that he couldn't restrain 3,000 Indians from 33 nations, which is sort of true, although as he had doubled the number of Native Americans present and claimed the British had given them rum, it neatly gets him off the hook, doesn't it? No one knows precisely how many people were massacred on that retreat from Fort William Henry. Rumours ran rife through the colonies, claiming that 1,500 died, and that from the garrison of 2,300, only 400 made it to Fort Edward, mainly the regular regiments led by Monro, who actually died 3 months later. In reality, many of the column had actually been taken prisoner. Remember, the Indians had signed up on the promise of captives as well as loot and scalps. Others fled into the forest, where they slowly made their way back to European settlements over several months. So, in the immediate aftermath, with so many people, especially the colonial militia and camp followers, just disappearing, you can see why many in the colonies fully accepted the worst-case massacre figures. Montcalm personally negotiated a ransom from the British to the Indians that resulted in the release of 500 captives. Hundreds more remained prisoners, and up to 40 subsequently refused to leave their new enforced homes in the wilderness. Whilst James Fenimore Cooper, in his novel Last of the Mohicans, suggested hundreds were massacred, modern historians, especially Ian Steele in his 1990 book Betrayals, have revised the figure down to less than 200. Whatever the exact number, a massacre did take place, and it took on a legendary status in colonial America, Remember Fort William Henry became a recruiting cry for militias as the war continued. It also hardened attitudes of the colonists towards Native Americans, almost justifying any return massacre or land seizures as revenge against untrustworthy savages who didn't honour the terms of the surrender. And that perception continued well into the 19th century, not least thanks to James Fenimore Cooper's novel published in 1826. However, there were two unforeseen impacts also resulting from the massacre. Firstly, it would cost the Indians dearly, and secondly, it would contribute to the ultimate French loss of Canada. How did it cost the Indians dearly? Remember that I said that in their lust for scalps, the Indians had dug up the graves at the fort? Well, many of those graves contained not British defenders killed by French cannon and musket, but victims of smallpox. Those Native Americans unwittingly carried the disease back to their homes. A huge smallpox epidemic swept the nations living around the Great Lakes area. The Potawatomi, for instance, were almost wiped out. Secondly, the massacre also contributed to the ultimate French loss of Canada, and here's why. Despite the plunder, captives and scalps taken from the retreating column, Montcalm's native allies felt bitterly betrayed by the French when they cut their deal with Monro. 1,600 Native Americans operating through the forests might have made a real difference, smallpox permitting, when the British finally invaded Quebec. But they stayed away. Indeed, straight after the massacre, his allies deserted him, and Montcalm abandoned plans to advance further into the British colony of New York. Instead, he burned Fort William Henry to the ground and retreated back up the lake. As an aside, the fort was finally rebuilt in the 1950s as a tourist attraction, and it remains so to this day. But there was one final outcome from the massacre that worked against the French. The officers and men of the 35th Regiment argued that the attack went against the terms of their surrender. They had agreed to the parole of not fighting for 18 months in return for safe conduct to Fort Edward. The new British commander in North America, General Abercrombie, agreed with them and voided their parole. They fought on in the war with immediate effect. On the 13th of September 1759, the 35th stood in the British line as General Wolfe faced the French outside Quebec City on the Plains of Abraham. And here, with Wolfe famously dying as victory was achieved, French power in North America was broken forever. The defeated French commander was none other than the Marquis de Montcalm. And as he retreated back to the city, he was mortally wounded and died early the following morning. But the deaths of the two generals, the end of the French Empire in Canada, and the Battle of Quebec is for another day. If you love learning about British history, not just the battles, but the wider events and people across the centuries, then you might enjoy my weekly newsletter. Recent articles have included the history of Tower Bridge and Britain's World War I riots. Get your copy by clicking on the link in the description and join me as we keep discovering the amazing stories from British history.